Good morning. We're going to continue our series in the book of 1 Peter. A soldier deployed overseas, and while he was overseas, he received a Dear John letter. And in the letter, his former fiancée told him that she had found somebody else, and not only had she found another man, she was also engaged to him. And then at the end of her letter, she asked this favor. She said, "Would you please send me back the photo of myself that I gave you before you deployed? It was my favorite picture, and I want to give it to my new fiancé." A little bit arrogant, however you want to call it. But anyway, so this guy was just crushed. I mean, just heartbroken. So he shared the letter with his brothers in arms in the barracks, and they all kind of got together and they came up with an idea. Each guy in the barracks would donate a picture of his girlfriend and put it in a shoebox. And then they placed her picture from the Dear John thing, and they took them and they put a note in it, and they said, "I'm sending your picture back to you. Would you please pick it out? For the life of me, I can't remember which one it is." Now that's a great group of friends. A group of guys that can sympathize with you and love on you. And sympathy and love are just two of the characteristics that we're going to look at this morning in our continuing study of 1 Peter chapter 3, where Peter's going to give us some information on dealing with government and our behavior toward our employers, although he talked about it in the terms of slave and masters. And then he carried it over, as we've studied in the last few weeks, to the husband and wife. And so the commands that he gives us in this summary section are contrary to what the world puts out there. And he's saying, but you're not part of the world, and your behavior needs to look differently. And when your behavior looks differently, you glorify God and you are a great witness in this world. And then he continues on. The next phrase there, he tells us all of you. He says, I want all of you to get along. I want you all to be like-minded or live in harmony with each other. And you may have noticed that these previous three sections were addressed to certain groups of people. They were addressed to husbands and wives. They were addressed to slaves and masters. But now he zeroes in and he says, all of you, like all of you, are to be like-minded. So the things that he is going to mention, they're for every one of us. You might say it this way, these are for all of you, no exceptions. He ever noticed that it's easy for us to notice how other people should act and what the flaws of other people are? of us experience conflicts. You know, we disagree with our spouses sometimes. Sometimes we argue with our children on how much screen time they can have or what they can watch on TV or maybe what curfew is. You know, coworkers differ on procedures. Business partners, they disagree on strategy. Friendships are splintered over just petty arguments. Political parties are rarely in unison. The church, it's not immune either. Folks have different taste in music and they have different opinions about decor of facilities and how to handle certain matters. If you live around people, you're going to experience conflicts. And again, Peter says, yes, you're going to have conflicts. But if you'll put these 6 attitudes into practice, there will be a dramatic improvement in your relationships with your spouses and with your children, your parents, your employees, your friends. He says, do these things to reduce conflict. And so we're just going to kind of look at these things that he's going to mention this morning. I'm going to spend a lot of time in this first verse just looking at each one of these words, and then he mentions a couple other things in the verses that follow. So the first thing he says is, be sympathetic. Now I think when we hear that word sympathetic, a lot of times we think to ourselves, sympathy is like feeling sorry for somebody. That's not what he means when he uses the word sympathetic here. The term sympathetic, if you go back and look in the Greek, it's a compound word made up of a root word suffer and then a prefix with. So the word originally meant to suffer or to feel with. It's not an exterior emotion. It's an interior emotion that comes from within. This feeling of emotion that you have for somebody, especially when they're going through a hurt or a pain. So to sympathize simply means to understand and validate or affirm someone's feelings. Not necessarily their ideas, but their feelings. When you're sensitive to their feelings, you don't belittle them. You don't put them down. You don't say things like, well, you shouldn't feel that way. Do you realize it takes a certain amount of arrogance to tell somebody they shouldn't feel a certain way? That takes some arrogance. But when you're sympathizing with somebody, you are validating somebody else's feelings. And sympathy does 2 things. First, it meets 2 basic human needs. All of us have a need to be understood. You want somebody to understand you in this life. And then secondly, all of us have the need to feel like our feelings are okay. You know, sometimes we have these feelings like, am I just crazy? Am I just weird? Does anybody else feel this way? When you find someone that is sympathetic with you, it not only says I understand, but it says I validate your feelings. I may not agree with you, but it's not a matter of right or wrong. It's just validating somebody's feelings. Let's suppose that you're having trouble with your eyes. And so you go to an optometrist. And the optometrist has a really brief conversation and a really brief exam. And then he says to you, he takes off his glasses and he says, try these. I've had these for 10 years. They've done great for me. I've got an extra pair at home. You can have them. So you put them on and things are even worse than they were before. This is terrible, you say. I can't see a thing. Well, that's kind of weird. What's wrong with you? They work fine for me. Try a little bit harder. Well, I am trying. I can't see anything. It's a blur. Well, then you just need to think a little bit more positive, he says. And you're like, I'm positive. I can't see a thing. Boy, are you ungrateful, he says. All I've done to help you. What are the chances that you're going to go back to that optometrist for vision issues? But how often do we do that in our communication? How often do we prescribe before we've actually diagnosed? How often do we do that? Think about another example. I bet you can identify with this if you have kids. especially teenagers. Maybe you say to your daughter, "Come on, honey, tell me how you feel. I know it's hard, but I'll try to understand." "I don't know, Mom. You wouldn't think it was right. You might think it's stupid." "Of course I wouldn't. You can tell me, honey. No one cares for you as much as I care about you. I'm only interested in your welfare. Why are you so unhappy?" "I don't know, Mom." "Come on, honey, what is it?" "Okay, well, if you really want to know, I don't like school anymore." "What? What do you mean you don't like school anymore? Don't you know how important education is? Don't you know how hard your dad and I have worked to give you a good education? Don't you know that's your future? You just need to apply yourself just like your older sister does. You could do better, then you'd like school. Time and time again, we have told you to settle down. You have the ability, but you just don't apply yourself. Try harder, get a better attitude about it." Now go ahead, tell me how you feel, sweetheart. But is that not what we do? We just kind of rush in and we try to fix things without knowing and fully understanding the story. So you remember last week I gave you guys 6 things to talk to your wives about based on verse 7 in husbands and wives. I would ask you to raise your hand if you did that, but I'm afraid to, so I won't do it. But anyway, I did it, so pat me on the back, but anyway, no. But so I sat down with Renee this week. There were 6 questions. One of them is the one that we kind of stalled out on a little bit. I think the question was, do I listen to you? Do I really listen to you? Talking about, I'm the I. And this is what she told me. She said, and maybe she was just being nice, but she said, "You're a pretty good listener." Maybe she was just being nice, I don't know. But she said, "You're a pretty good listener." She said, "But you don't always listen till the end. You jump ahead and try to fix stuff." Isn't that what happens in a lot of conversations? We prescribe before we diagnose. We fail to try to deeply understand the problem of the other person first. And Peter says the first building block here to diffusing content is to understand where people are coming from. Understand their background, understand their temperament, understand their circumstances. In a word, listen. When you listen, then you're being sympathetic. Sympathy, the way Peter's talking about here. Too often we fill our conversations with our own autobiography, don't we? Like we want to tell somebody all about our stuff and what's going on in our life without listening and without trying to understand what's going on in another human being's life. How do you become sympathetic? Use your ears more often and your mouth less. Learn to listen. When you learn to listen well, you automatically become sympathetic. When you listen, you say, "I care." When you listen, you give them a great gift by saying, basically, when you listen, you're saying, "You're valuable. You're important." Listening says, "I care about you." People don't care how much you know until they know how much you care. Stephen Covey wrote a book called The 7 Habits of Highly Successful People. One of the 7 habits is this. He said, "Seek to understand before seeking to be understood." You know what the Bible calls that? Wisdom. Wisdom. Understanding gives a man patience. If I understand what you do, why you do it, I'll be more sympathetic to you. If I understand, I'm going to cut you some slack a little bit. It's easy for me to be more accepting, more accommodating if I understand why you do what you do. And one of the reasons we have so much conflict is because we don't validate people's background. We don't give any credence, and we don't understand what they're saying and what they're doing is based on their personal history. Sympathy is saying, "I validate your feelings. I understand them. I may not agree with them. I may not feel that way. But you don't belittle them, you don't downgrade them, you don't make fun of them, you don't ridicule their feelings or their grief or their emotions, their doubts, their fears." So the first building block here is sympathy, validating, listening. So how would you rate yourself on sympathy? 10 being great, 1 not so much. Or let me ask it a different way. How would your spouse rate you on sympathy? If your spouse would say, my husband-wife is very understanding, give yourself a 9. If you say, my husband-wife ignores my feelings, give yourself a 1. If you say, my husband or wife ridicules my feelings, give yourself a -10. Then I'll just close this first point with this statement. I think it's kind of interesting. One of life's major mistakes is being the last member in the family to come down with the flu after all the sympathy has run out. A lot of truth in that. So sympathy is the first one he mentions. The second one that was on that list in verse 8 was brotherly love. Love is brothers. Being committed to a relationship. When you're in a relationship, you're committed to that relationship. That means you're on the same team. You're in the same family. You're in this together. You're not competing with each other. You're complementing each other. You're cooperating with each other. And that's very important when you're trying to solve conflict in a relationship. When I get irritated with my kids or somebody else, or when I'm angry or upset, it's really easy to start focusing on the problem instead of the relationship. And if you're not careful, and this even happens in marriages, you start seeing the other person as the enemy instead of somebody that's committed. They're not the enemy. They're your spouse, or they might be your kids, or your friend, or a parent, or whatever. You're on the same team. Brotherly love says, let's stop attacking each other and find a solution to the problem. It's a subtle shift in the way you're addressing a problem. Instead of going, I'm going to affix blame to this, it's her fault or his fault or somebody's fault. But instead, it's not that. Let's find the solution together. We're on the same team. That's what we're talking about here. Brotherly love, commitment. You know, part of loving each other is accepting each other's differences. We're all different. And it means that I'm going to love you even though you're different. And if you've been married for any length of time, you understand that you're probably not going to change that person. And you accept them for who they are. If you say, I'll love you if, that's not really love. That's conditional love, but it's not real love. Acceptance says, I have faults. You have faults. Real love says, you know what? You can be a little flaky sometimes, but I'm a little flaky sometimes too. We're all a little bit flaky sometimes. Might depend on what day of the week it is. It might depend on what other things are going on in your life. But we accept each other. So that's the second one he mentions, brotherly love. The third one is this, compassion. That was the third on that list. Be compassionate. This word compassionate is kind of interesting. Originally, it referred to the intestines or the bowels or the inner organ. So it was thought to be emotions that are deep within, intense emotions that come from deep within a person. Ella Wilcox was a famous poet. She passed away a number of years ago. But she once witnessed a strange phenomenon in the back of a train car. She said she was sitting there kind of in the middle of the train car, and she noticed this lady up front who was sobbing. And not just a single tear coming down the cheek, she said. This lady was uncontrollably just heaving with sobs. She said, this lady is up front. It was making her a little bit uncomfortable, she said, with this just sobbing, deep sobbing. She said at the back of the train car, there was this older gentleman that was telling jokes and sharing funny stories, and everybody back there was laughing. So she said the lady up front is sobbing and the people in the back are laughing at this man's story. And then she noticed something, she said, that I thought was really interesting. She said the people in the front who were around this sobbing lady began to move toward the back so that they could laugh and joke with the old man who was telling the funny one-liners. And then she wrote this old adage that we've all probably heard. Laugh and the world laughs with you. Weep and you weep alone. And sadly, her observation is probably true more often than not. The dictionary defines compassion as a feeling of deep sympathy and sorrow for another who is stricken by misfortune. But it's accompanied by a strong desire to alleviate the suffering. Notice that word in yellow there, the word alleviate. Compassion is more than just feeling sorry for somebody. It means to be compelled to do something. I think a lot of us, we hear the evening news or some catastrophe takes place locally or on the evening news, and we say, that's terrible. I feel so bad for those people. That's awful. And then that's as far as it goes. We have some feelings that quickly process through our brain, and we're kind of done with it. But that word there, desire to alleviate, means that compassion is action. It's doing something. Jesus modeled that kind of compassion. You may remember the story just a couple examples, when the leper comes to him. He has leprosy, and he kneels before Jesus, and the scriptures say Jesus was moved with compassion, and he touched him, and he healed him. In another instance, the Bible says Jesus saw this large crowd, and when he stepped from the boat, he had compassion on them, and he began to teach them many things. So his compassion led to action. So really, compassion is defined as love in action. If sympathy is understanding someone's feelings, compassion takes it a step further, and it demonstrates it in action. It's asking the question, what can I do for you? And I think there's two ways that we can kind of display compassion. First is this, by what we say to other people. Over in the book of Ephesians chapter 4, verse 29, it says, "Do not let any unwholesome talk come out of your mouths, but only what is helpful for building others up, according to their needs, that it may benefit those who listen." You'll notice there's a couple phrases there that are kind of highlighted in yellow. I'm actually going to go to the second one first. It says our speech is to build other people up. Would you characterize your speech that way? Do you use your speech to build other people up? Or is your speech maybe a little bit more toxic, filled with verbal bombs and verbal arrows that destroy? That second phrase there, unwholesome talk, is kind of an interesting word. It actually goes all the way back in the original language to be talking about like a dead, smelly fish. So basically what he's saying is, don't have a fish mouth when you talk. It's kind of a graphic kind of illustration there. But instead of that, instead of having fish mouth, build each other up. And the Bible says that we have compassion by the way we talk to each other. And even when you have difficult things to say, there's a right time and a right way to say it, the hard things, to say them, to keep a situation from escalating and blowing up. So showing compassion is partly how we diffuse conflict. Secondly, it's how we act toward each other. Over in the book of 1 John, it says, "Dear children, let us not love with words or speech, but with actions and in truth." Compassion is saying with your actions, how can I make your life easier? What can I do for you that'll make it a little bit easier? You know, probably one of the most memorable and tragic stories to ever come out of the Winter Olympics was, I think it was 1988, when Dan Jansen, the speed skater, if you don't remember the story, Dan Jansen was an Olympic gold medal hopeful. Everybody thought he would win. Just hours before he was supposed to compete in his very first event in speed skating, his sister, who was battling leukemia, died. Just hours before. So when the time came for him to race, he laced up his skates, took off, very first turn, you know those tight ovals they use for speed skating, very first oval, he slid out, lost. He later participated in another event, didn't do well in that either, he slipped again. Just devastated. And I think the whole United States, just our heart went out to this guy. I mean, just letters just poured in for this guy. Many Americans sent him letters, including, according to Sports Illustrated, he received a letter from Mark Arrowood, a 30-year-old disabled man from Doylesville, Pennsylvania. This is what he said. Dear Dan, I watched you on TV. I'm sorry that you fell 2 times. I am in those Special Olympics. I won a gold medal at the Pennsylvania Summer Olympic Games right after my dad died 7 years ago. Before we start the games, we have a saying that goes like this. Let me win, but if I can't win, let me be brave in the attempt. He went on to say, I want you to have one of my gold medals because I hated for you not to get one. Try again in 4 more years. Dan Jensen said inside the envelope was one of Mark Arrowood's gold medals that he had won in track and field. That's compassion. Not just something processing through the brain, but an action. How would you rate yourself on compassion? Would the people that are close to you say that you're a very giving person? If so, give yourself a 9. If your favorite phrase is, how can you make my life better? Give yourself a 0. Fourthly, humility was another word in verse 8. The church should be a model of humility in the way we relate and interact with each other. Our focus needs to be on others and on Christ. That's what our mission statement is all about, connecting people to Jesus and each other. That's the direction that we need to point the spotlight. That's the type of love that Peter is talking about. So how would you define humility? Let me just give you a definition. It is being honest with my weaknesses, my needs, my failures. It's not assuming that I know it all or understand everything that you're saying. It's being willing to admit a mistake. I can be humble. I think it also means there are some words and some phrases that we can say. If I'm humble, I can say 4 difficult words. I need your help. Those are hard words to say, especially in our society. It means that you're being vulnerable, that you're willing to take help, to take a risk to say that. I don't think that comes easy for us. The Bible tells us where to bear each other's burdens, but how can we bear each other's burdens if we don't know what the burdens are? And humility says, you know what? I'm struggling. I need some help. That takes humility. There's also a 3-word phrase that I think is really difficult for us to say that requires humility. I was wrong. Now, that's another phrase that's hard to say. Some of you maybe remember the sitcom Happy Days. And there's a scene in there where the Fonz is having to get a job. And he's never had to get a job before. And he has trouble saying the word job. It's like he gets caught in his throat. You mean I have to get a job? Well, I think that word wrong is kind of the same way for us sometimes. It is for me. You know, I am wrong. Kind of gets caught in the throat sometimes, like trying to swallow dry crackers without having anything to chase it down. But when I'm humble, I can admit I'm wrong. I was wrong. I can even add to that, you're right. That's hard to say. Hard words to say. But there's also a couple other words. Forgive me. Sometimes those stick in our throat just as much. Forgive me. But I think they're a little easier to say when we realize that Jesus forgave us and that he offered us forgiveness. And I can offer forgiveness. And I can say I'm wrong. And I can say, please forgive me. And I can stop demanding perfection. You realize perfection doesn't exist in any relationship. Know that God has worked in your life and he's forgiven you. And you can admit you're wrong and you can ask other people's forgiveness. So how do you rate on humility? Do you find it difficult to back down? Do you bully other people back into a corner all the time? How easy is it for you to admit that you're wrong and ask forgiveness? Give yourself a 1 if the words "I was wrong" hadn't passed over your lips since 1997. Give yourself a 9 if you can easily ask for help when you really need it and admit you're wrong. So those are the words found in verse 8. I'm going to look at a couple other words real quick in the remainder of the passage. Next one is keep your composure. As Christians, we need to keep our composure. Peter puts it this way in verse 9. He says, do not repay evil with evil or insult with insult. Now that's hard, isn't it? Because when somebody does something wrong to us, we instantly want to retaliate, right? We want to repay evil with evil. We want to repay, and you insult me, I'm going to insult you back. And then he goes on the contrary, repay evil with a blessing. Now that's hard. Because to this you were called so that you may inherit a blessing. Except the first thing we want to do is hurt somebody back when they hurt us. But what does that do? It escalates the situation, right? Turns a molehill into a mountain. Scott Bayless relates this story. He said, while I was pastoring a small town church in southern Illinois, he said, we had several young families join our church our first year there. He said most of these young families hadn't been actively involved in a church for a long time, so they were still getting used to the idea of being part of God's family. He said one of these young moms, and he changes the names, he says, Betty, was having a birthday party for her daughter and invited some other kids from the church. My wife happened to mention to Veronica, one of the other moms at the church, only to discover that Veronica's kids had not been invited. Now, that's not normally a big deal to most people, but it was a big deal to her. She felt insulted and hurt and humiliated, so she retaliated. She called her friends, bad-mouthing Becky, making sure that she knew everyone knew how she felt. Lines were drawn. And Scott continued, and before long, despite my best pastoral efforts, both families dropped out of the church. And he concluded his story, when Christians fight amongst themselves, nobody wins. There's an old African proverb that says, when elephants fight, the grass always loses. The average African elephant weighs 14,000 pounds. And when they start throwing their weight around, there's a lot of collateral damage. Having a loving church family is challenging sometimes, but it's even more so when oversized egos start throwing their weight around. That's why Paul urges us, keep your composure rather than retaliating. When somebody steps on your toes, when somebody hurts your feelings, take a deep breath. Then calmly talk to them and let them know why it hurts your feelings. And if you have to wait a day or two to do it calmly, wait a couple days. And in doing so, you're paying them back with a blessing. And chances are they probably never intended to hurt you anyway. But even if they did, God has called you to bless them, and He will bless you in return. Repay evil with a blessing. That's a challenging statement. Last one is this. Be a peacemaker. That's his final suggestion for handling disputes. So with all these comments about hot tempers and conflicts and disputes and cold shoulders, Peter quotes from the book of Psalm. And here's what he says in verse 10. For whoever would love life and see good days must keep his tongue from evil and his lips from deceitful speech. In verse 11 he says, he must turn from evil and do good. He must seek peace and pursue it. You'll notice that word evil there is kind of highlighted. Evil is used 5 different times in this paragraph, and it refers to living for ourselves in disregard of others, except as other people can serve us. Just because you're a Christian doesn't mean you still don't have that evil bent in you to do things for yourself or to have other people do things for you. Just because you're a believer does not eradicate that bent toward evil that we all possess. Any honest Christian will tell you that. For instance, I have a pretty short drive to work. So when I'm driving to work, and I'm doing the Lord's work, right? So I'm driving to work and I'm listening to Christian music and I'm praising God and somebody cuts me off, what am I going to do? I'm going to say, God bless you, have a great day, I'm praying for your salvation, right? No, I'm probably going to slam on the brakes, yell something, honk the horn, whatever. Because it's hard to retaliate or to bless, do a blessing instead of retaliating. Why do I do that? I think the answer is the same as it is for the toddler who throws a tantrum. I didn't get my way, and I want my way. In fact, I think when you analyze anger, so much of the time it stems from one source. I didn't get my way. That's a barrier that hinders a lot of relationships. The root of most interpersonal problems is our selfishness and wanting our own way. Probably even prove it this morning. You're sitting here this morning thinking, man, I hope my spouse is listening to this. Needs to hear this. Do you know most church conflicts are started by somebody not getting their way? Think about that. But there was another phrase that was highlighted there. It's not just enough to deny or turn ourselves from evil. We must actively pursue good and peace. Paul put it this way in Romans 12:18. If it is possible, as far as it depends on you, live at peace with everyone. In other words, peace is not just going to happen. You have to actively pursue it. You just can't be passive. You have to be aggressive in going after it. The church needs peacemakers. I think essentially, there are two different kinds of, when we're talking about this peacemaker kind of thing. There are thermostat people, and then there are thermometer people. A thermometer, so if a room is hot, the thermometer's hot, right? Because it tells you what the temperature is. If the room is cold, the thermometer tells you that it's cold, and it's cold. But a thermostat, if the room is cold, you can turn it up and make it hot. And if it's hot, you can turn it down and make it cold. A peacemaker is a thermostat person. A person that can change the climate of a room or a conversation or whatever. Have you ever seen that happen? You're in a room and everybody's complaining and everybody's negative. And then somebody walks in with a cool head and they're spirit-led. And all at once the temperature of the room changes because of that person. God wants peacemakers in the church. He wants peacemakers in the workplace. He wants peacemakers in the world. He wants peacemakers who don't dwell on the negative but look at the positive and see all the things that God is doing. And it takes a lot of spiritual maturity to be that kind of person. But you can do it. I can do it. We all can do it. And the more we allow God's Spirit to work inside of us, the less hard-headed and less hard-hearted we become, and the more like Jesus we become. And then just kind of wrap this up. Now, some of you might be thinking, now wait a minute, Pastor. You've been talking about laying down my rights and not retaliating and bless those who insult me and being harmonious and sympathetic and peaceful and brotherly love and kind-hearted and all that kind of stuff. Pastor, don't you know that it's a dog-eat-dog world out there? If you knew my spouse, if you knew my roommates, if you knew my coworkers, you know I can't live like that. They'll trample me if I try to do that. Who's going to look out for me? Who's going to protect me if I do that? Peter tells us in verse 12. That's what he says. For the eyes of the Lord are on the righteous, and his ears are attentive to their prayer. But the face of the Lord is against those who do evil. Our responsibility is to please God by doing good in our walk and our talk. He is responsible to protect us, to answer our prayers. Close out. Barbara Bush spoke at Wesley's College commencement. This was a number of years ago. Here's what she said. As important as your obligation as a doctor, a lawyer, a business leader will be, you are a human being first. And those human connections with spouses and with children and with friends are the most important investments you will ever make. At the end of your life, you will never regret having not passed one more test, winning one more verdict, or closing one more deal. You will regret not spending more time with your husband, a child, a friend, or a parent. She closes with this sentence. Our success as a society depends not on what happens in the White House, but on what happens inside your house. We're going to close a little bit differently this morning. I'm going to show you a video that talks about somebody that's struggling with conflict and how he integrates God's word into that. Play that, please.
Be quick to listen, slow to speak, and slow to become angry. James 1:19. What causes fights and quarrels among you? Don't they come from your desires that battle within you? James 4:1. There is a way that seems right to man, but in the end leads to death. Proverbs 14:12.
The application coming out of all that we looked at last week was to begin to understand the most difficult part of any conflict was seeing our part in it.
Encourage one another daily, as long as it is called today. Hebrews 3:13.
Hey, hun, do you think that I feel I always have to win an argument?
Well,
Hey, that's not an answer. Actually, that is an answer.
Why do you look at the speck that is in your brother's eye, but do not notice the log that is in your own eye? I invalidate people when I get worked up.
sometimes, yes.
When you win an argument, you don't really win anything. A person's wisdom yields patience. It is to one's glory to overlook an offense. Proverbs 19:11. Finally, brothers, rejoice. Aim for restoration. A fool takes no pleasure in understanding, but only in expressing his opinion. Be completely humble and gentle. Be patient. Be devoted to one another in love. The one who has knowledge uses words with restraint. Honor one another. Comfort one another. Agree with one another. Love others. Forgive others, as Christ loves and forgives me.
You're ready.
Can we get out? Can we get out? Can you guys?
Yes, we can get out. What can I carry?
Here.